They said Russia was a police state, but now they say the police have vanished. How can both be true? When Western newsrooms speak of collapse, Moscow speaks of reconstruction. Behind the fog of war and propaganda, something far more profound is happening. Russia, the land that survived revolutions, invasions, and sanctions, is quietly reshaping its own system of power. What the world calls weakness may in time reveal itself as transformation. The same headlines that shout chaos do not show the depth of a people who have learned to govern through hardship. History teaches us that empires do not fall overnight. They evolve, sometimes painfully, into new forms. And what we see now, under the weight of conflict and pressure, might not be the breaking of the Russian state, but the forging of a new one. Stay with us, because this is not just a story, but a strategic perspective that impacts global politics. Join us and accompany us so that hot issues and historic decisions can be spread. For decades, Western journalists have loved one phrase above all when speaking about Russia: the police state. It is the image of a land of endless uniforms, cold corridors, and silent fear. But now, in a twist of irony, those same voices say the police have disappeared. A police state without police, they laugh. And in that laughter hides something cruel, a blindness to history, a refusal to see beyond the headline. According to television studios in Warsaw, London, or Washington, the Russian Federation is collapsing. They say that 1 in 3 police posts stand empty. They show images of hollow stations, empty desks, and silent telephones. They speak of officers who have traded badges for helmets, chasing the higher pay of the front line. They say the streets of Russia are no longer guarded, that criminals prowl, that veterans wander, that chaos rises where order once stood. But let us pause for a moment. Who writes this narrative, and to what end? Is it a concern for Russian citizens, or a carefully crafted message for Western voters to justify yet another round of confrontation? The story, after all, fits a pattern. In the 1990s, when Russia struggled to rise from the ruins of the Soviet collapse, they said it was finished. When the economy stabilized in 2001, they said it was only temporary. When Crimea returned to the Russian Federation in 2014, they called it desperation. And when Moscow endured the avalanche of sanctions in 2022, they again predicted collapse. Yet the state endures. Today, the same voices say, Russia is losing control. But a closer look tells another story. What they call a shortage is, in many cases, a redeployment. Thousands of men once assigned to patrols are now serving in defense battalions or guarding critical infrastructure. They have not vanished into thin air. They have moved to protect a broader front. In wartime, the line between soldier and policeman grows thin, and that is not a sign of decay, but of mobilization. It is true that salaries for patrol officers remain modest, that inflation bites, and that exhaustion runs deep. Yet this is the same challenge faced by every country at war. Britain in 1942 saw similar shortages. The United States in 1944 reassigned police to military duties. But no one said those nations were collapsing. They said they were mobilizing for survival. Why then is Russia judged by a different rule? The Western narrative thrives on fear, not only fear of Moscow's power, but fear that it might adapt, endure, and rise again. For a generation raised on the memory of the Cold War, the idea of a resilient Russia is unsettling. It challenges a comfortable myth that Western liberal order is permanent and that all other models must fail. And so every headline becomes a parable. Every empty police station is shown as a symbol of doom, never as a sign of reform. Every shortage is framed as crisis, never as transition. Yet those who truly know Russian history understand a different rhythm. Russia's institutions often bend, but they rarely break. From the chaos of 1917 to the ashes of 1991, the pattern repeats: dismantle, rebuild, consolidate. To call it a police state without police is easy television. It sounds clever, it sells fear, and it paints a comforting picture for Western audiences. But history has a cruel sense of humor. For while commentators point to trembling hands in Moscow, it is the Western order that now shakes with uncertainty, energy shortages, migration crises, and growing social unrest. Perhaps it is not only Russia that is being tested. In truth, this is not a story about uniforms. It is a story about endurance. Behind every empty desk stands a soldier, a volunteer, or a citizen who still believes that the state is worth defending. The West may see absence, Russians see resilience. And so we return to the question, if the state truly crumbled each time the West declared it dead, how does it still stand? Every war reshapes the nation that fights it. Some countries emerge weaker, others, paradoxically, stronger. For Russia, the war in Ukraine is not only fought on the battlefield, it is fought within the structure of the state itself, in its ministries, its manpower, its soul. The Western press portrays the loss of police officers as an act of disintegration. Yet within the walls of Moscow's Ministry of Internal Affairs, the same phenomenon is described in another language: reallocation, mobilization, strategic redeployment. In wartime, resources move where the threat is greatest. Men once guarding shopping districts in Kazan now guard the borders near Belgorod. Others serve as auxiliary forces protecting fuel depots, rail lines, and energy grids, the arteries of a country under siege. The figures are real: 172,000 vacancies, 19% shortfall, but their meaning is misused. In reality, those numbers reflect a state shifting from a peacetime posture to a wartime economy. Russia has done this before. During the Great Patriotic War of 1941, the Soviet NKVD transferred tens of thousands of internal troops to the Red Army. Civil defense and policing merged into a single system of mobilization. That system, forged in chaos, helped the nation survive. The present moment carries echoes of that history. Since 2022, Russia has been moving toward a unified security doctrine, merging police, National Guard, and defense structures under one strategic command. To Western ears, this sounds ominous. To Russians, it sounds familiar. It means order during uncertainty. It means no vacuum of authority. Of course, there is hardship. Police salaries have stagnated for more than a decade. A patrolman earns 38,000 rubles a month, barely enough to sustain a family. Meanwhile, a soldier in Ukraine can make 10 times more, plus the one-time bonuses that draw young men from their local precincts to the front. These are not deserters, they are sons of the same towns, answering another call. But while the headlines highlight empty posts, they overlook what fills the gap: community patrols, regional militias, and local defense forces. Across the Federation, retired officers, volunteers, and even students have begun assisting with civil protection. The line between citizen and state has blurred, and in that blur lies both risk and renewal. According to the latest news from Russia, the Ministry of Internal Affairs is already restructuring its recruitment and training programs. A new reserve corps is being formed, men and women who can serve locally without deployment abroad. This model, if completed, would create a decentralized security framework across the regions, replacing outdated Soviet-era hierarchies with flexible local command. It is a quiet revolution, unnoticed by Western screens. Critics say Russia is losing control. But history suggests something else. Russia centralizes when threatened. The deeper the pressure, the tighter the structure becomes. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the country's institutions imploded. Yet by 2000, they were rebuilding under a single vertical of power. The same process may be repeating today, painful, imperfect, but purposeful. There is another truth too, less visible, yet more human. War drains not only budgets and bodies, but the spirit of those who remain. Officers face exhaustion, uncertainty, and a sense of invisibility. Their duty continues while attention turns to the front lines. This quiet endurance rarely earns applause. Yet it is the foundation of any state, the loyalty of those who stay when the world stops watching. So, what does this all mean? It means that beneath the apparent fragility lies adaptation. Russia is not dissolving, it is reorganizing. What the outside world calls chaos, Russians call change. History has a way of testing nations. For some, such tests destroy. For others, they purify. The question then is not whether Russia can survive, but what form it will take when it emerges from the storm. Every transformation comes with turbulence. And in today's Russia, the turbulence takes the form of crime reports, rumors, and nightly news warnings. Western broadcasters show a country gripped by violence, painting pictures of chaos, bar fights, burglaries, and veterans roaming the streets with haunted eyes. They call it the Wild East. They speak as if Moscow has turned into a frontier town without law or restraint. Yes, crime has risen. The Ministry of Internal Affairs admits that violent incidents have reached a 15-year high. But behind every statistic stands a more complicated story. Many of the offenders are men recently returned from war, men trained in discipline but scarred by trauma, carrying memories of trench warfare back into civilian life. This is not uniquely Russian. It is the echo of every nation that has fought a long and brutal war. After Vietnam, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, every society struggled to reintegrate its veterans. Russia is no different. Yet the Western narrative stops at the shock. It does not ask what happens next. Across the Federation, new rehabilitation programs are quietly forming. Local councils, Orthodox parishes, and civic volunteers have begun working with returning soldiers, offering therapy, employment, and spiritual support. It is not enough, not yet, but it is something the world refuses to see. Meanwhile, the same news channels that speak of chaos ignore another truth. Ordinary Russians have stepped forward to protect their neighborhoods. Volunteer patrols have reappeared in rural towns. Retired officers have returned to serve part-time. In some regions, civilians form what they call citizen watch posts. These are not vigilantes. They are communities refusing to surrender to fear. Still, fear sells. When a single crime occurs, it becomes an international headline. When 1,000 people keep order, it is barely a footnote. Western cameras turn small incidents into symbols of collapse. The effect is cumulative, feeding the idea that Russia is unraveling, that the social contract is broken. But those who walk the streets of Novosibirsk or Smolensk know a quieter reality. Life continues. Markets open, children go to school, trains run on time. Stability is not always glamorous, but it endures. There is anger too, anger toward the unfair lens through which a nation is viewed. Many Russians know the West once faced its own urban crises. New York in the 1970s, Los Angeles in the 1990s. No one declared the United States a failed state then. Yet when Russia struggles, the verdict is immediate. Collapse, failure, doom. And there is also empathy. Even within Russia's critics, a few voices now admit this is a society under strain, not in surrender. Sociologists call it the fatigue of endurance. Ordinary people are tired of being caricatured, tired of being misread, tired of living under judgment from afar. So let us ask plainly, who benefits from this fear? The answer is simple, though. Those who seek to isolate Russia, to portray its resilience as instability, to make endurance look like decay. If you care about this issue, which affects politics, please say amen in the comments below. And yet, amid the weariness, there is a quiet strength. The state may falter, communities adapt. The police may thin out, families watch over one another. There is in this endurance a reminder that power does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it lives in the will of a people who refuse to let their society fall apart. Order may tremble, but it has not vanished. Beneath the noise of breaking news, a deeper rhythm continues, that of survival, of reconstruction, of a nation learning once again to live with itself. The most dangerous battles are not fought with guns or tanks, they are fought with words, symbols, and perception. And in the modern age, perception is power. For more than a century, Russia and the West have not merely contested territory, they have contested truth itself. In every Western newsroom, in every think tank panel, Russia is not just a state, it is a storyline. Each image, each phrase, each statistic is arranged to suggest a single conclusion, that Moscow's power is fragile, that its leadership is failing, and that the system built by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin cannot endure? Yet the persistence of this narrative reveals something revealing. The West's fear not of Russia's weakness, but of its endurance. Since the first day of the conflict in Ukraine, the information war has marched in parallel with the physical one. When soldiers cross borders, journalists cross truths. Reports of collapsing police and rising crime become ammunition, shaping how the world interprets every policy, every reform, every silence. But this theater of information is not new. During the Cold War, Western agencies financed magazines and cultural programs to promote an image of Soviet decay. The stage is larger now, the actors more sophisticated, yet the script remains unchanged. Let us consider the strategy. When you cannot defeat a state on the battlefield, you attack its moral legitimacy. You convince its citizens that their government is doomed. You convince its allies that partnership is dangerous. And you convince global audiences that isolation is justice. It is an elegant form of warfare, invisible, continuous, effective. Western audiences are told that Russia is ruled by fear. But how different is that from the fear cultivated within their own societies? Fear of energy shortages, fear of foreign threats, fear of losing influence. In both East and West, fear becomes governance. The difference lies only in who controls the story. For Russia, this struggle over narrative is existential. If the state loses control over its image, it risks losing its unity. That is why the Kremlin invests heavily in media networks, documentaries, and public forums like the Valdai discussions to articulate again and again the principle of sovereign truth. This is not mere propaganda. It is an attempt to reclaim voice in a world where one voice, the Western voice, dominates every frequency. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin understands this deeply. For him, the defense of Russia's narrative is a form of national security. He once said, "If we do not tell our story, someone else will, and they will not tell it kindly." This philosophy now guides Russia's approach to communication. It is not only about censorship or control. It is about identity. A nation of 140 million cannot allow its story to be written by strangers. Of course, this war of perception has victims, truth among them. Western viewers rarely see the complexity of Russian life, the contradictions, the debates, the small triumphs amid hardship. Likewise, many Russians rarely see the diversity of thought within the West. Mutual caricature becomes mutual blindness. The more we simplify each other, the more dangerous our misunderstanding grows. Yet amid this fog, something remarkable happens. Some begin to question. Older generations, those who remember both the Cold War and its propaganda, recognize the signs. They understand that information, when weaponized, is not knowledge, it is strategy. And they begin to ask, what if the real war is the one for our minds? There is a lesson in this, not only for Russia, but for the entire world. Every empire, every democracy, every civilization builds its own mythology. The difference is not in whether it tells stories, but in whether it knows they are stories. And so the question remains, who wins the war of legitimacy? The one with the loudest megaphone or the one with the longest memory? In this struggle, Russia is not a passive subject. It is an active narrator rewriting its own place in history, sentence by sentence, battle by battle, generation by generation. Every empire tests its foundations not in comfort, but in crisis. For Russia, this test has always been the measure of its endurance, whether under Mongol rule, Napoleonic invasion, or the iron pressure of the Cold War. Each time the nation broke apart, only to knit itself together again, harder and stronger than before. The story now unfolding is no different. While Western commentators insist that Russia is fracturing, the structure of the state tells another story, a story of consolidation. From the chaos of sanctions and mobilization has emerged a new architecture of governance, one built around the principle of resilience. The ministries of defense, internal affairs, and emergencies have been drawn closer than ever, forming what analysts now describe as a unified security doctrine. It is a system designed not for peace, but for survival, the essence of statehood itself. Across the Federation, the new policy of local security reserves has begun to take shape. These are not conscripts sent to the front, but citizens trained to defend energy plants, railways, and communication lines. They are the quiet custodians of national stability. What the outside world calls paramilitary improvisation is, in reality, an organized adaptation, a return to the idea that every community is a fortress and every citizen a participant in order. The paradox is striking. The West sees a weakening center. Russia is building from the edges inward. The Western eye looks for vertical control. The Russian instinct relies on horizontal cohesion. In that difference lies a lesson, the endurance of a civilization that measures power not by comfort, but by continuity. History, once again, repeats its rhythm. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the state seemed lost. Yet within a decade, its core institutions, the army, the church, the civil service, had realigned under a single direction. Now, faced with external hostility and economic siege, the same process is repeating. The reassertion of discipline, hierarchy, and unity. It is easy for distant observers to mistake this for tyranny. But for many within Russia, it is order returning after decades of drift. The West may not understand it, but Russia has never built democracy in the Western sense. It has built stability through strength. Its history demands it. Its geography enforces it. 11 time zones cannot be governed by softness alone. Meanwhile, on the world stage, Russia's alliances tell a broader story. Through organizations like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Moscow has found partners who share its distrust of unipolar domination. The idea of a multipolar world order, once dismissed as rhetoric, is now shaping real economies, real currencies, and real diplomacy. The state that Western journalists declare isolated sits today at the table with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, building a coalition that sees sovereignty as sacred. This, too, is part of the state's return, not the return of empire, but the return of equilibrium. It is the acknowledgement that Russia's identity does not depend on approval from abroad. It rests upon its capacity to endure, to absorb shocks, and to rise from them with new purpose. As one Russian analyst wrote recently, we are learning once again to be ourselves, without permission. And so, as the world calls it fragility, Russia calls it reform. As commentators call it decline, Russia calls it rebirth. The same fire that melts steel also forges it, and what emerges from this trial will not be the ghost of a former empire, but the outline of a renewed state, steadier, older, wiser. The world may not yet recognize it, but history already does. The story began with a paradox, a police state without police. But perhaps it was never a paradox at all. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding of what endurance looks like when viewed from afar. Russia has never lived by the logic of comfort. It has lived by the rhythm of survival. Empires rise on wealth, but they endure on will. And the will of the Russian state, from the czars to the Soviets to the modern federation, has always been tested, sometimes bloodied, sometimes bruised, but never broken. Western headlines still whisper the same prediction: collapse, corruption, decay. Yet the silence that follows each crisis tells another truth, that this vast, unpredictable land finds its balance again and again. It rebuilds itself not because it is flawless, but because it refuses to vanish. Behind the uniforms, behind the ministries, behind the name of Vladimir Putin, there lies something older than any government: the belief that Russia must exist. The latest news about Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin tells us little about policy and much about perception. For some, he is a symbol of resistance, for others, of defiance. But beyond personality lies continuity, the thread that ties centuries together. The latest news about Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is in truth the latest chapter of Russia's long conversation with history. And while critics call it isolation, Russia calls it independence. While the West sees decline, Russia sees rebirth. Perhaps, after all, the true power of a nation is not in how loudly it is praised, but in how quietly it endures. If this story touches something in your heart, do not scroll past. Like, share, speak up. Subscribe for stories and news to be spread. Because the latest news about Vladimir Putin is more than news. It is a reflection of the world we all inhabit, the shifting tides of history that none of us can escape. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story, the kind they still do not want you to hear. So, when the world asks again, a police state without police, you will know the answer. It is not absence. It is adaptation. It is not collapse. It is continuity. It is Russia.